So there was this moment in the COVID-19 pandemic where it seemed like we might be on the verge of creating a national safety net.
So close. We got so close.
We did, right? It seemed like maybe we were going to come up with ways of funding childcare, ways of protecting unemployment, ways of offering universal medical care. And then it all fell apart.
Yeah, it was like we got right to the edge and then it all fell away.
Yeah, so why?
Yeah, you're asking me. I mean, it always happens like that, I think. The way our disaster policy is built, there are disaster times and then there are normal times. And you do these things in disaster, but they're not meant to affect the normal times. So you pull them back, you turn them off when the disaster is over, even if what's happening is the disaster is really revealing something terrible that's underneath. We, as a country, we never wanted to go in there and kind of fix those problems that we find.
Even though historically it seems like moments of crisis like this have led to more egalitarian societies, right? Like we know the Black Plague led to, I mean, it was disastrous, right? But it led to greater egalitarian and economic development in Europe.
Yeah, this guy, Walter Scheidel, this historian, went through all of human history and looked at what actually made societies more equal. And it's always crises. It's either a crisis like the Black Plague, where so many people died, you sort of had to make things more equal, or it's a crisis where you intentionally set out to fix those inequalities you find. And he said that those are the only ways to make societies more equal.
And that's crazy, right? Because COVID-19 is arguably the largest global catastrophe of our lifetimes. And we failed to use it to make this kind of new and good policy.
Yeah, and we've done that over and over again. Favorite story, 1927, Great Mississippi Flood. Both of our favorites. Great books on it by Scotty Parrish, by Richard Mazel. And, the way the story goes, Herbert Hoover is the incident commander for this flood. He's taken a lot of heat from W.E.B. Du Bois, who says that the sharecroppers in the South, the African Americans who were forced to do farm labor, he said they were slaves in everything but name. And Hoover said, oh, Du Bois is coming for me. I better appoint a conservative commission of Southern African Americans who are going to have my back, essentially. So that's convened by this guy, R.R. Moten, who heads up the Tuskegee Institute. And they come together and they look at the situation and they send Hoover a letter. And the letter says, listen, Herbie, this is your chance to fix the unfair economic conditions of the South. You've got the political capital, you've got the funding, the nation is on your side. Use the window into the horrors there caused by this flood that flooded hundreds of thousands of acres and killed thousands of people. Use that lens to fix the economic capacity in the South.
And it's worth saying that this was the first federally coordinated disaster response. Right. So this is sort of a historic moment in which this proposal could have gotten uptake and it could transform the way that the United States does disaster response.
Yeah, there was a real shot. Herbert Hoover was of the party of Abraham Lincoln. Why wouldn't he want to? He was going to run for president. Why wouldn't he want to make this great step for liberation? And, then he asked the Red Cross.
Right. And they were the ones already on the ground coordinating the response with local, predominantly white leadership.
Right. And, up until the 1950s or so after the Stafford Act, the Red Cross was the boots on the ground for most American responses. And they said to him what they said in all kinds of situations before and since. They said, no way. Our job is to recreate society exactly as it was the day before the disaster. We're not getting our hands dirty. And it's not our job. Our job is only to fix things back to the way they were before. And the craziest part about it to me is that Du Bois's newspaper made fun of them, even back in 1927. They wrote, this is crazy, right? And it's crazy on the face of it. In a massive disaster, you've got your thumb on the scale. You're either going to help restore the existing social situations and therefore stand on the side of the oppressors in this case, or you're going to work on changing them. Either way, your hands are dirty. Either way, you're involved. You can't not be involved. And to think otherwise is ridiculous.
So in this episode, we're going to think about the 1927 flood as this kind of inflection point in U.S. history that shapes the way in which disaster policy works to this day. To do this, we're going to talk to both an emergency management expert. That's right. And also, shocking, I know, a feminist philosopher.
What?
I
Crazy.
I know. Because one of our goals for this podcast is to get philosophers, feminists, scholars in conversation with emergency management experts, scholars, and practitioners to see if we can build new kinds of conversations about these problems. So we're super excited that today we are joined by Jeff Schlegelmilch, who is the director and a research scholar at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at the Columbia Climate School. He is the author of Rethinking Readiness and the co-author of Catastrophic Incentives. He's got a long history of both responding to and theorizing about disasters. And we're also joined by Carol Hay, who is professor of philosophy at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. She's the author of Think Like a Feminist, of Kantianism, Liberalism, and Feminism, Resisting Oppression, as well as a cool new textbook on the philosophy of love and sex.
And I'll just say, just as a little bit of a teaser, it's really the only discussion I've ever been in where threesomes and BDSM seem like useful tools to think about risk analysis.
You know what? You're welcome.
I'm Mitch Strickland, an emergency manager.
I'm Dr. Jordan Pascoe, a feminist philosopher. This is Tough Shift, a podcast about how disasters change us
and why we need to change how we respond to disasters.
So I want to start with a little bit of a warm-up question, since we have some very different avenues into this today. So Jeff and Carol, we already know this about Mitch, so he can sit tight. How did each of you start thinking about disasters?
Jeff, I think you should go first because this is actually your job. This is more of a side gig for me.
It's actually a side gig for him too, Carol. That's the
yeah. Really, I'm just waiting for this acting gig waiting for the phone to ring. No, I was in Chicago at DePaul University at the theater school there, working on my Bachelor of Fine Arts in Theater Studies. And this may sound a little cliche, but that I was in there studying theater. They have a saying in the arts that if there's anything else you can do and be happy, you should do that instead. And so I think I was kind of
They say that about philosophy too.
I feel like it fits in a lot of contexts. Anyway, I had my own existential crisis, but the 9/11 happened during that. And then in terms of a lot of the pathways that opened up, I got really interested in sort of, what this means, how the disasters sort of, this disaster of 9/11 and the anthrax attacks sort of exposed all these different societal relationships, these different actors within society, different agencies, and also compelling to do something about it. And so interest and opportunity and really being at the middle of a lot of sort of world-altering events in the early days, kind of post 9/11, I think sort of drew me into the field.
So yeah, my side gig, I think, is basically just as a political philosopher, focusing mostly on feminism. I think I'm predisposed to think of political philosophy in what philosophers call a non-ideal sense, which is where we look at how these sort of lofty political ideals actually play out, both historically and contemporarily, or in contemporary times. So, it's one thing to sort of think about, the foundations of historical liberalism or these sorts of things. And I do, right? So like Jordan, I'm a big Kant fan. So Jordan and I have this dirty little secret that we're these feminist philosophers who love Kant. And so I think both of us in our careers have spent a lot of time convincing like the Kantians that they should care about feminism and the feminists that they should care about Kant. And neither of these, I think like the feminists have good reason to be skeptical of Kant because Kant is a raging misogynist, among other things. But the Kantians probably really should be more open to feminism. And I think actually throughout my time in philosophy, I've seen very slowly, the Kantians sort of start to become a little bit more open to feminist and sort of oppression theory in general, but it's been an uphill battle, definitely. So I think that kind of methodological background on my part sets me up to be interested in something in a project like this because, I think how things work when things don't work, right? What's going on when the systems that we spend a lot of time convincing ourselves are fine show themselves to be what they are, which is profoundly not fine, right? So as an anti-oppression theorist, I know that really well, but I think disasters are a really sort of a clear instance of how that works. So yes, I think I've only written one thing in the realm of disasters. I've published a piece a couple of years. It was actually funny. I was rereading it and preparing for this podcast, and I wrote it sort of at the height of the pandemic, and it was like this nasty wave of nostalgia. Like, oh my God, things were so fucked up back then. I forgot. Like, I'd almost managed to forget just how awful things were. And in rereading it, it was, I was unpleasantly reminded. So that's me and why I'm here and what I'm looking forward to talking about.
I just want to say, Carol, in talking about Kantianism and like your relationship with Kant and Jordan's relationship with Kant, Jordan and I have been married for more than 10 years now, and Kant has been there the whole time. So it's almost, I've been in a threesome, I feel like, with Kant for like a decade. And I don't know if Kant would be into that, but that's been my experience of my life, I think. Yeah.
And that literally happened as we were writing this book. Mitch and I were, we were framing this book out. We were working on it. And about a year into it, he came into my office and I was surrounded by Kant books. And he was like, what's going on? And I was like, I just have to write a book about Kant real fast. I'll be right back. I promise. But like my ex-boyfriend called and I just have to write this Kant book before I come back and write the disaster book. So I took a disaster vacation to think about Kant. And then I came back.
Perfect.
I know. And I'm so proud because we do not talk about Kant in this book. And that was like a very intentional, it's a very intentional choice. So for those of you who came for the Kant, this is it. Me and Carol right now, this is all the Kant there is. We're just going to move on.
We're putting a lid on it.
I just want to say that, and I mean this sincerely, this is already the greatest podcast I've ever been a part of. So thank you.
How many podcasts start with a threesome with Kant? Like so few.
Yeah.
I think this is probably the only one.
Well, I have to say, Carol, that piece that you wrote about COVID, which I think came out in September 2020, something like that. Mitch and I were in the process of framing out the arguments of this book, and we read that piece and we were like, yes, this like it was a really sort of seminal moment for us in being like, okay, good. This is a conversation that needs to be had, right? And that we can think about how to flesh out these arguments. And so I wanted to maybe start tonight with COVID, since it's something that all of you have written on. And so I'm curious, and Jeff, I'm pulling here a little bit from something that you've written about, the way in which COVID sort of exceeded our conceptions of disaster in certain ways, and that it left no one untouched, right, on the planet. And that it confirmed the ways that 21st century disasters do not fit the mold of 20th century disasters in some really important ways. And so one question I wanted to ask all of you is, does this fundamentally change how we think and understand disasters? Like, do you think COVID fundamentally changes our understanding of disasters?
Who wants that one? I'm going to actually quote Jeff on this, because I remember at the beginning of COVID, and I want to see if you own this, we are having a conversation and you said something that I keep repeating to other people, and I mostly cite you, but sometimes I forget to cite you. That's on me. You were like, this is a movie. It's like watching a movie that you've seen before and you know how it's going to end, but you have to sit there and watch it fall apart the way that you thought it was going to fall apart. And then it does, and you're sort of trapped in it. Do you remember that at all?
I don't remember that specific quote, but I do remember saying like that was my general approach. I was going to say philosophy, and I'm realizing I'm in the presence of philosophers. But that was my general sort of way of being in the pandemic. I remember we were doing these calls with other centers and things throughout the Earth Institute, which is now the Climate School, sort of trying to figure out, how to navigate this. It was very obvious how things were going to play out. And we had gotten through the spring wave, and it was in the summer. And I remember one of the center directors, when you say something and you think, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said it that way. But one of them was asking like, oh, all the projections are that the winter's going to be worse. And we're not doing anything as a nation to really prevent that. In fact, we're rolling things back. And I said, yeah, the spring sucked. The winter's going to suck harder. And we need to kind of prepare ourselves for that. And so I think that there are certain, patterns that we sort of see, right? And there's sort of a discrepancy between the patterns that you observe in disaster research that don't translate in the ability to control the outcome, right? And so we were looking at all of these things in terms of, okay, we had this reprieve, we had sort of this seasonal reprieve, and a lot of folks were kind of hoping that it would just magically go away, like SARS-1 and all these other things, and it was very clear that it wasn't. But it's also sort of like we needed to get there. People needed to get there and sort of needed to see what would happen. And I don't know if it was just sort of nihilism on my part or sort of acceptance or also just sort of in disaster planning rather than trying to control the outcome to try to manage within forces that we couldn't control. But instead was that don't plan for what should be happening, plan for what is happening and what is likely to happen. And so I think to your question, Jordan, I think COVID certainly provided the data to fundamentally rethink how we look at disasters, just like other major disasters we've had have provided the data that we ignore and that we don't take into account. I think other things like I think the pandemic spurred a lot of thinking in other areas like climate change and things that are we're seeing more engagement on, but people don't want to talk about pandemics now. People don't want to legislate around pandemics. And we sort of see sort of this like, ooh, we made it through that. Let's never talk about it again, which is probably, not good for society.
All
Some
right,
whistling past the graveyard, yeah.
we're starting in a dark place. Let's see if we can make it worse.
Well, Carol, you were sort of saying that before, that going back and reading this piece, you'd sort of blocked out some of how bad it was.
Yeah.
And that's something I'm curious about where you remember being when you wrote that argument, and also maybe a little bit of how you think about it now.
Sure. So I think when I was writing that, the piece came about because I was asked to speak on a panel that actually a Brazilian university was doing. They were pulling some philosophers together to sort of like get some hot takes on what was going on in the pandemic. And it was still at that point relatively early, and we were still, distancing and things like that. So, most of my life was online, was on social media, right? And so in some ways, what I took myself to be doing was just collating all of the hot takes on social media, or at least my response to what I sort of saw happening on social media, in headlines and these sorts of things. And then, of course, then it was the summer of the Black Lives Matter uprisings, right? And full confession, right? I was getting some pushback from people within my life, right? Because I'm a Canadian, but I've been living in the U.S. for a really long time, and so I was out on the streets protesting. I had my daughter out on the streets protesting, and I had friends, family contacting me saying like, "What the hell are you doing? How can you be protesting in the middle of a pandemic?" And of course, I just threw some Audre Lorde at them and said, we don't get to pick the time of our revolution, right? So yeah, it really was a very sort of extreme, like a time of emotional extremes in a lot of ways. And for me, it just really kind of it laid bare the privilege, right? Because again, like social media is such an echo chamber, right? And so like just you tend to sort of bark out these opinions. And I was seeing, it was almost like these people who like sometimes they were political philosophers, or people whose politics would have suggested that they were maybe a little more open-minded and aware of the way injustice can actually sort of play out. Really just like their privilege was showing, right? And the things that they were interested in, the things they cared about, the way they approached it was just, they were so very much entrenched in the worldview of like hunkering down, maintaining the material privileges, the safety that they had, right? And forgetting that most of the people in the world didn't have that safety, right? That the problems of rich white assholes like me, right, where we were bored and in our, perfectly comfortable homes, right? Those are not the problems of most of the world in this pandemic, right? And so, yeah, that was sort of, I think in some ways I'd forgotten. And I really tried to make that piece optimistic in some ways, right? So I sort of said, maybe what this is that things have gotten so bad that even the most privileged can't pretend things are fine anymore, right? It's gotten so bad, right? And that was one way to sort of, and I still think that's right, actually. That's one way to sort of explain why the Black Lives Matter movement got the kind of social uptake it did, right? Was that finally white people were willing to listen, and they had the bandwidth, and they realized just that things had gotten so bad. I mean, flash forward 4 years, white people are perfectly happy to forget again, like shocking. So I'm back to being pessimistic in that way, I guess.
One thing we say, I think that picks up on what you're saying, Carol, about disasters is we sort of talk about this perceptual shift that happens when a disaster comes. The world as you understand it suddenly doesn't function anymore. And so your perception shift, and you go into the state we call disaster natality, based on Hannah Arendt's idea of natality, where you're sort of birthed into this new kind of political action, like political lowercase b, working with other people. And then what you have to do is you have to diffract that. We kind of steal that from Donna Haraway. Boy, we're just stealing from people all over the place in this. But in Haraway's idea of diffraction, your ideas are being constituted through other people. And for us, that rise, the change in the solidarity structures around Black Lives Matter really was driven by this idea that people's perceptions were shattered. They were looking for new connections. They found new kinds of solidarity across difference because suddenly, as you mentioned, like the lid of all the troubles in the world had kind of come off, and they were visible in a way that they weren't before. And it created something, and here's another poll we're going to do. These things we call contexts of collective creativity from Elizabeth Armstrong. It becomes this place where you can create new narratives and new ways of understanding the world. And we were all kind of in that for a minute. And I think what was hard for me watching it and hard for Jordan and I writing about it, and I think you point to this now, is, and then it was like it got slammed shut. right? We built a safety net, we created these connections, and then for some reason they just broke again. They went away. And that was sort of the tragedy to me of how we as a society responded to.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It was such a moment where there was so much possibility, and I feel like it's sort of gone. And so I haven't read the whole book, but the parts of the book that I have read, one of the things that I really liked, that I wanted to kind of pick your brain more about, was this sense that we need to be really explicit when we're thinking about disasters, about what the goal of this recovery is supposed to be, right? And if the goal is to just get us back where we were, then if where we were is a massively unequal society, then the goal is massive inequality. And I really like how you pull this out, and you make that really explicit in the book.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'll take that, and I'm going to throw it to Jeff though too, because I think Catastrophic Incentives does another version of this. It's like a mirror image of what we're trying to do. So, and in looking at this, it goes really far back. Right? Like it goes all the way back to the founding of the country. Michelle Dauber wrote this book, The Sympathetic State, which I think is amazing. And she says that this idea of focusing on nostalgia in disasters, the idea of a disaster response is the nostalgic restitution of loss, which is what she calls it, goes all the way back to the 18th century when Congress agreed to pay this guy, Thomas Jenkins, $167.50 for the loss of his brig Minerva in a fire. They didn't give anything to the sailors, right? They didn't help, them get their lives back in order. They were giving money to the property owner. And Dauber argues that was baked into all the disaster response since then, baked into the New Deal, and then baked into FEMA and the Stafford Act in recent years. And that sort of understanding that what we're trying to do is build back after a disaster. Maybe it's better, but we're still building back or backwards is like embedded in all of our disaster recovery thinking. And I guess I wonder, Jeff, what do you think about that idea? Because there's a lot of stuff in Catastrophic Incentives that I feel like it kind of relates to that, but does that go too far? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think it kind of gets me thinking back to the, age-old question on like pop culture. Does it influence society, or is it a reflection of society? And it's probably more conversational in terms of that. And I think on the one hand, how we design disaster response, how we prioritize it is reflective. And I think you guys do a really good job of sort of reflecting at sort of those key points where there were opportunities to reframe disaster management. And they said, no, we're just going to take this from a build it back to the way it was perspective, not an opportunity to improve things. That being said, there is an extraordinary amount of money that is spent on disaster recovery. I had one colleague actually do the math and argue that it is really sort of the largest shadow budget going into that it's billions and billions and now trillions of emergency spending outside the normal deliberative congressional process in the United States alone, going into things like infrastructure, going into things like rebuilding societies. And so if we're not consciously choosing how to spend that money, we're sort of reinforcing. So it's really, the disaster recovery funding is an economic stimulus bill. Disaster recovery funding is it's a societal development bill as much as it is about sort of recovering. And the incentive structures just don't align with long-term thinking, right? It's all about speed. And that's one of the things, this is one of the things I found really frustrating with the COVID pandemic. We knew the inequities. Anyone who's been in this business more than 20 minutes knew the inequities that were going to show up in the data. Didn't even need to see the data. And then when we did see the data, we're like, oh yeah, of course, right? One of my favorites was there were all these images that were coming out showing the mortality rates of COVID-19 on maps. And then it would show the vaccination rates. And it was like a negative image, right, from the old film cameras, right? The places that were least impacted from fatalities were the most likely to have access to vaccines and have them more quickly. And that's the playbook. You get vaccines as quickly as possible to the population. They're going to move as quickly as possible to those who have access to the benefits of civil society, which are built on inequitable lines. Then you complain about the inequities if you're on the left. You don't mention it if you're on the right. And then you get reelected because things moved quickly. And so these incentive structures are sort of hardwired into how people go to the ballot box, into how shareholders sort of evaluate the health of a company, into how donors evaluate how well their money is being spent. And a lot of these incentive structures are ultimately antagonistic to sort of broader strategic, sort of more holistic goals that we aren't very well prepared or very well prepped to think about in these tremendous opportunities with all this money and all these resources that sort of flow in after a disaster.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess the question I want to ask from there is about how and why those are the stories that we focus on, right? Like in other words, because Jeff, I think you're absolutely right. There's nothing about the data that was necessarily surprising, right? Yeah. And yet the dominant cultural narratives and the narrative that was driving policy wasn't necessarily reflective of the data that was so unsurprising. So how are the stories getting constructed that are, I don't know, parting ways from the data? Like is the data then driving the conversation, do you think, or are there other stories, other influences that are pushing things forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it ultimately comes down to sort of like what are the incentives of different parties. So in the political space, particularly in the U.S., it's electoral incentives. And I remember in the early days of post 9/11 and some of the work we're doing and thinking like, oh, if only people understood like how bad disasters were. We have to educate elected officials. And then I realized like the elected officials are not responding to a lack of information, they're responding to voter behavior. And so there are some articles and some research done in political science sort of looking at what is this relationship between voter behavior and disaster funding. And the ones that I've read has shown no correlation between disaster preparedness funding. We can see all data that consistently shows preparedness saves, spending pre-disaster prevents post-disaster, and there are different dollar amounts and different methodologies. But there's no voter signal. Voters don't care about it. Post-disaster, roughly every $25,000, $26,000 spent, and this is an older study, so in with inflation and things like that, who knows, maybe $30,000 buys you a vote. So there's a huge signal from voters in terms of reelecting you if you bring in money quickly after a disaster and are perceived to be doing well. And there's a negative incentive, too, in terms of people being voted out of office.
I have a question, if I can jump in. So this is the question from a philosopher to the two disaster folks in the room. And Jordan, maybe you can translate if need be. So hearing what you're saying, Jeff, it sounds to me that this is what philosophers would call a collective action problem.
Sure.
And so a collective action problem is where you have things that are individually rational. So it's rational for an individual person to behave one way, right? But then if everyone behaves that way, you get this suboptimal result at the level of the group, right? So this sounds like a textbook case of a collective action problem, right? Where it's individually rational for people as politicians, as property owners, as business owners, whatever it is, right, to do one thing, right? But then if they do that, then we get this massively suboptimal result at the group level, right? And at least one of the ways that philosophers think about like the whole point of government is to help us as individual people deal with these collective action problems, right? So this is precisely the point of government is to solve this. And so it's really interesting for me to hear you say in this really kind of concrete example, you're like, yeah, government's got nothing. Right. And I'm like, but that's the job. Like, that's your point. So like, what would you say to that?
I know this. I'm the guy, in the first episode, we had a drinking game where, you had to drink every time anybody said the word epistemology. And then it didn't work that fast. It happened so fast. We just got so drunk. We had to close the podcast because we kept using the word. But it goes back to the story about 1927 that we told kind of at the beginning of the podcast to me, and the nature of the relationship between Herbert Hoover and the Red Cross. And this goes even farther back from that. But this is a really startling moment for me as a disaster person, because it shows how the world could have gone differently. In a disaster, you can't help but put your thumb on the scale. You're either going to support existing institutions or you're going to change them, but you can't help messing with the culture that's there, right? You can't pretend you're not part of the underlying social dynamics. So the tragedy to me, Carol, to answer your question, is that I feel, and I feel cynical at this point. I feel the hurt of like every situation report that I've ever written to an incident commander in my life. Like, I feel that our structures are created precisely in order to not let disasters prompt equitable social change. That, like, on purpose, they were designed to fund recovery exactly the way things were before. And we've got a bunch of examples. San Francisco earthquake is another great example of this. Katrina, I think the recovery is a great example of this. In COVID, it was like we were kind of trying to break out, right? Especially with like the federal long-term equitable recovery and resilience plan. I think that was great. Like so many good people are trying with all good intentions to break free of that cycle, but we just keep getting snapped back because the underlying idea is privileged nostalgia that we keep that we keep using to design recoveries. That's what I think. And I'm going to drink because I think I said epistemology at least one time during that. Maybe I didn't. I don't know. But anyway.
Drink anyway.
I mean, this takes me back, Carol, to your sort of story of like sort of collating what's happening on social media, right? And this strange tension. And I think this was particularly clear in the sort of the unfolding of 2020. That on the one hand, the pandemic was leading many people to see injustices that had been invisible to them before, right? Like one of the examples you point to that we write about too is like men being like, oh my God, childcare is so much work, right? Because they were suddenly at home with their kids and they were forced to see all of it, right? And so you have sort of, men recognizing how much labor raising children was. Not that they were doing it necessarily, but they saw it, right? Yeah, right. But then at the same time, as you were saying, you've got all these people who are responding with their own sense of privilege and entitlement, right? Like it's, Jeff, it's sort of like that you've got to put the vaccine centers in the places where those people are. Otherwise, they'll complain and get mad, right? So there are incentive structures that are going to end up further privileging the privileged, right? So I think, how do we think about that tension, right? The degree to which a disaster is likely to lead me to see forms of oppression that I didn't see before, and the degree to which a disaster is likely to harden protection of my own privilege.
So one thing that I've been thinking about since rereading the piece, thank you for that trauma, making me do that, was I think, again, like different versions of missed opportunities, right? So a concept that I know you talk about in the book is feminist epistemology, or standpoint epistemology, and I will now drink.
Got a refill.
And one of the central ideas of standpoint epistemology is that there are epistemic insights, which is things we can know that are available to people at the margins that are either difficult or impossible for people who are more privileged to actually have, right? And I think something like COVID is a really nice example of that, right? And so you can think about this in terms of an opportunity, right? Where if you take yourself to be someone who's concerned with issues of justice, broadly speaking, and again, and if you're not, there was another internet meme that said I don't know how to convince you that you should care about other people, right? So yeah, so if you don't care about justice, then this is probably not going to necessarily move you. But if you do, and I think most people do on some level, right? They care about being a good person. And there's this question about how do I sort of help people who need help more than I do. And one way is to just actually listen to them, right? To sort of understand that given the way our society works, where privileged people, things are easier for privileged people just in general. And one of the things that are it's easier for us is our ability to know things, to know how things work, right? Because we have access to education, because media is written by and for people like us, whatever it is, right? There's lots of different reasons why it's easier to be privileged people like us. But that means that there's things that we're not going to be able to know, right? Or the things, and so it's actually in our best interest to just shut up and listen, right? Like as Kendrick says, sit down, be humble, listen, because there's things that we can actually learn from people who are less privileged than us, right? And so an example that I didn't talk about in the article, but that I've been thinking a lot about was the norms that already existed in BDSM, SM, and ethical non-monogamy or poly communities. When it has
right,
there you go. We started off with threesome with Kant, and we're back to it, right? All right. So
this sounds more exciting. I just want to.
But these communities, for good reason, have very, very, very sophisticated and well-articulated norms of communication when it comes to risk aversion, risk tolerance, these sorts of things, because they have to, right? They've had to be very, very good. And they come up with things like safe words. They come up with things like when it comes to protections for safer sex, right? It has to be the preferences of the most risk-averse person in a polyamorous group have to be the protections that everyone agrees to, right? These sorts of things, right? So these marginalized groups in society actually have come up with very sophisticated ways of communicating that work in their ways of interacting, right? Can you imagine how helpful it would have been when people were navigating their social bubbles and things like that, if everyone in the world, everyone in America, right, had been given a sort of basic sit down, understand this is how you talk about these sorts of things, that these norms already existed in ethical non-monogamy communities. right? I think it would have been fascinating, right? But of course, everyone thinks that they're like, everyone meaning like mainstream folks, right? No, these people are bad. These people are perverted, right? We couldn't possibly have anything to learn from them, right? But again, then I think like you sort of saw these more, mainstream, communities coming up with versions of the same norms eventually, but they would have got there a lot sooner had they just listened to the freaks, right? I say that as a member of the freak community. I don't know. What do you think?
Actually, I wrote a paper about this, Carol, about the way in which the forms of communication that we were all forced into in the pandemic don't actually look a lot like consent as we understand it. They look a lot more like these more robust forms of negotiation and sort of like risk navigation. And so every time someone sort of says, oh, but consent is like the best we can do, I'm like, no, because actually what we were doing in COVID was something much, much more complex, right? We had to agree on a risk threshold that we were willing to take on. We had to have these serious communications about what you were doing over there when you weren't with me and how that was going to impact the kind of risk that I took on when I was with you. And you're right. These are critical conversations for like healthy sexual relationships. They're forms of communication that have been developed in these kinds of communities, and they were suddenly mainstream. But none of us talk about it like we were like that's what we were doing in those months. But that's what we were doing in those months, right? Yeah. So we're here for the BDSM and kink conversation. Also, glad we could bring that to the table. Yeah.
Well, it becomes this question about. That's actually so helpful thinking about what BDSM can offer risk analysis, right? Which is, and it brings to mind when you're looking at standpoint epistemology, we talked a lot about Sandra Harding's idea of strong objectivity, which is the idea that there is not an objective version of what risk is, which is what government is always trying to do. The idea of risk and the standpoint of the person who is participating in that risk. And to me, strong objectivity is so useful because you have to take into the stance of the looker, the person who is analyzing risk, as well as any objective idea of risk. This is it's sort of like calculus for sociology for me because it takes into account the motion of the knower and the motion of the idea at the same time. And that is something we've never been able to do in the emergency management community. We're always creating a map of risk. Here's our map of risk, and it's one objective map of risk. And it always seems like those risks are facets of the community themselves, right? Like somehow the community owns these risks. It's the community's problem how vulnerable it is, which doesn't take into account at all that these risks have been usually created by outside structures. And the community is being held to them. And so we put these risks on the communities and they become almost a mark of like shame that we're looking at from a privileged position. And it makes it very hard to engage with those risks in a way that will make the privileged people who are deciding on the emergency plan take them to heart, like take them as really essential to the response that we're going to do.
I think that this is all really interesting. There's two things I'd want to bring up. One is we look at sort of equity and representation in emergency management, which has gotten slightly less whiter and male in the preceding years to a gradual
slightly less khaki.
Yeah, slightly less khaki. Yeah. But what you end up with is you end up with a representation of one sort of value system and one sort of worldview. I think across diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism movements, right? Why representation is so important. Because these policies inevitably are going to be more amenable to certain communities and less representative of others, right? I think back to there was an article written in April of 2020, and I cite it all the time by Babel and like 39 other authors, and it was in Nature, and it was on behavioral science and what it can teach us to inform the pandemic. It's an amazing read, and it's even more amazing when you realize it was written in April of 2020. And it basically predicted everything. We still did everything the way we did it. We don't use data except to complain about the lack of use of data. But they basically said, we have this pandemic. Let's look into behavioral science at all these different elevations and let's use it. Like, what does it tell us in terms of advice of what we can do? And it was one of the most practical articles I'd ever read. And one of the pieces, it looks at like in-group behavior and risk perception and all of these things. And one of the things that I always take to heart, especially I got into trouble in one encounter because I was in where I was born in Northwest Indiana. which is a very conservative area. It's got a lot of chemical plants. It's got a lot of agricultural areas nearby. It's got Trump signs everywhere. And sort of this idea of like, and then go back to a very liberal bubble like New York City. And I got in trouble for calling it a liberal bubble. And then a week later, the New York Times actually published an article sort of showing data that it was a liberal bubble. But it's just to say that we were fundamentally, sort of treating half of the population as sociopaths. And I was trying to trying to sort of reconcile what I was seeing in one part of the country with what I was seeing in another. And this article that I mentioned sort of talks about, community value systems and about how, you'll have, this was looking at more of a national level, communities with more of a collective identity are going to be more willing to make sacrifices for the benefit of the community. More individualistic societies, and this is where I'm editorializing a little bit here, but if we look at highly individualistic communities, your freedom, your individual choice is a very sacred thing. It's something that you don't let go of for anything. And so in public health, we throw all this data on it. Well, it's more healthy for the public if you do this, it's more healthy. And that's, I think, sometimes naive to that underlying value system, right? That this is your most precious thing, that your ancestors fought and died for. You don't give up this individual freedom. And all of a sudden, I sort of began to understand, and I'm not trying to say, conceding, points to, racist groups like the Proud Boys or things like that, but trying to better understand why so many people were so averse to being told what to do, I guess, to put it simply, and why we weren't getting any traction with data and things like that, because I think that there was an understanding of individual rights that is not fully understood. So I say this to say, too, that, we have a diversity of sort of value systems throughout our community, and we have a very binary way of communicating risk and even educating ourselves on risk. We talk about in my book in Catastrophic Incentives, right? A colleague of mine, Stuart Firestein, who's a professor at Columbia, talks about how we teach science. We teach science, it's true or false from the first test you take in elementary school. It's A, B, C, or D. There's a correct answer every time you learn science. When in the world is there ever a correct answer? When in the world is there ever a clear answer? And risk is really more sort of from different perspectives, from different value systems. And our emergency management systems are very checklist oriented. They're not very well, there are some tools for managing uncertainty, but not very well versed for sort of acknowledging risk aversion, underlying value systems, and how to navigate that, and how to sort of navigate kind of the sociology of that across different groups. And it doesn't really bode well for disaster resilience, in addition to other sort of societal survival scenarios.
And I think
go ahead.
No, please.
All right, fine, I will.
Yeah, go for it.
One thing I wanted to add on, I'm glad to hear you sort of articulate, right, that we need to sort of, do the thing that's hard, which is actually, empathetically put ourselves in the shoes of another person who's not very much like us in order to understand why they're reacting in a way that seems very foreign to us. And that's very hard to do. And I think it's especially hard to do in a situation like a disaster where the stakes seem so high, right? So I was happy to hear you sort of articulate, right, this sort of red state conservative worldview that would actually make sense of why these disaster restrictions were seen as such an affront, or seen as such a big ask in some ways, right? And I think just to sort of add more data onto this fire, right? So friends of mine who are people of color, right, or come from communities of people of color, right? Because again, these were other communities that had lower than white liberal bubble uptake of some of the COVID restrictions, right? Again, you could write these people off as irrational, or you could say, well, do these people have have the kind of reason that white liberals from Massachusetts do to trust the government, to trust government programs, to trust government restrictions? Do they have a history of being well served by these institutions? Hell no. Right. So, so if government is telling you, no, you can't see your family, you can't see your larger community, right? You're supposed to stay in your overcrowded apartment that might be a part of a multi-generational home, but you're not allowed to, go out and take care of your larger community or spend time with them. You could see that as, these people just refuse to socially isolate, right? Don't they know that this is what we need to do right now? Or you could sort of understand that, it actually doesn't make sense to accede to these restrictions, given who these people are and given what their history is, right? So I think just in general, we have to, pull ourselves out of our own asses in some ways, and that's very hard to do.
And I think that I love the pull ourselves out of our own asses thing, because emergency management is a field that's been trying to pull itself out of its own ass for 50 years now. and we keep not. And everybody talks a lot about how we keep not pulling ourselves out of our own ass, which I'm just going to repeat over and over again because it's a great fun thing to say. Yeah, there we go. But I think, I want to keep the epistemology drinking game because I'm about to make an epistemological point. I think that over time, people keep bringing up, and I think Jeff does again in Catastrophic Incentive, keep bringing up policy solutions to this thing, right? Which are accountability things, which are more democratic governance. I mean, these really important ideas that are there, and they keep not getting uptake. And that's the thing that I think people are wrestling with is, why can't we get ourselves out of our own ass? And I think the answer is epistemological in a certain way, which is we pulled sort of a couple of ideas together in this chapter about this. One of which is Kimberly Crenshaw from Mapping the Margins talks about rape crisis centers and about how rape crisis centers were funded to help people immediately after a rape with certain crisis services. And those services never were meant to address the underlying causes of the structures they found themselves in, which sort of led to the situation where the rape occurred. And she said in that framing that crisis, the idea of a crisis, was used to erase or eradicate their lived experience because it created the rape as this one-time event and not a whole lifetime of oppression that was leading to that event. And that aligns with this idea of crisis epistemology from Kyle Powys-White that we talk about, where he says in these emergency times, crisis epistemology allows you to think only of the present, like the binary Jeff is talking about. Like there's only the world of the crisis, and nothing that happened before really matters. Nothing that happens later matters. Everybody can just focus on the immediacy of the day-to-day, and it's a blank slate that we get to invoke our policy will on. And I think that the troubling thing is that there's this kind of weird contentment there where people who are responding to a disaster can let go of all of this complexity in their minds because crisis epistemology allows this kind of get out of jail free card where you can just shoot from the hip, right? You can be a little bit of an action star and you don't have to think about the complexities. And so that idea of crisis is the thing that we would have to let go of in order to change all of these policy solutions, to get our heads out of our own asses. We would have to sort of change this deeply embedded idea of crisis and crisis focus and that ever-present of it. And I think it's really hard. And that's why for us, we had to go below the level of ethics and below the level of policies to try and think about how you can re-engineer how people understand these disasters and how we understand ourselves during disasters, to have any prayer of figuring out a way to get our heads out of our own asses.
Yeah. I think I'm going to try and articulate this a drink in, and but please don't say epistemology because I'll never get through it if I, I think, we've defined disaster management as a consequence management field, right? The idea here is to manage the consequences, and it's as a field. It's grown out of civil defense and first responder communities. And really, it's only been over the last 20, 25 years, really in the post 9/11 era where we've seen fields of higher education bringing, really emerging. And I know we've had disaster researchers and people listening will cite Enrico Corantelli and Russell Dines and a lot of the sociologists sort of looking at this, but I'm talking about the field of practice. The field of practice has largely been divorced from the field of inquiry into this. And even the field of inquiry is very young, younger than psychology. So there are a lot of gaps in the data. So by defining these agencies through legislation and through process and consequence management, we have amazing emergency managers who are basing practice on systems that are inherently narrow in how they're defined. And then the other piece I'd mention is they're also sort of like as a government role. And I know emergency management isn't exclusive to government, right? It exists in all sectors, but let's talk about government for a minute. What is the role of government? Well, we don't have clear agreement on that. And I see this with some of the agencies that we work with, right? Particularly ones that have been around for a while, that, there are two ideas. There's a very liberal idea of government being, a change agent of building a more equitable society. And on the other hand, a very sort of Reagan-esque idea of emergency management, of where it's the private sector that should actually be writing the plans, and it's the role of the public sector to manage the contracts and to ensure that that's being done in service to that. So much sort of smaller role for government. So I think that these are all sort of really important things in terms of, we can look at sort of the promise and the reality of the field of emergency management in terms of the money that flows through it and the influence it could have and does have, whether consciously or not, on the outcomes from a disaster. But how we've defined it remains narrow. And we see this tension, right? We see things like trying to define whole of community and trying to define, community lifelines, but trying to see, depending on the administration, focuses on equity versus focus on hazardous materials. But I think that there's even just sort of at the core of this too is what is the role of government. And to date, in research, we've observed this whole of society phenomena of disaster response. But in practice, we still fundamentally have agencies of practice that are trying to do as much as they can within the confines of their authorizing legislation that has created them as a consequence management organization, not as a social change agent.
Can I just put a question to Carol based on that, actually? Because I wonder, Jeff, another way to say, I think what you're saying that was in Carol's piece is something Jordan said about like men and housework and childcare, right? Which was that in the pandemic, men did more housework and childcare, but they wanted like cookies for it. You know what I mean? They wanted somebody to give them a cookie because they did childcare or because they did housework. And I love cookies, and I'm always very excited when someone gives me a cookie for anything. And I think in emergency management, you get cookies for hitting your incident objectives, right? You get cookies from donors for doing shiny things that don't solve the problem. And I guess from a status of privileged knowers who are being asked to do different kinds of collective action for society in ways that they're uncomfortable with, you sort of say, I think, well, they feel good if they're doing more than other people, right? If I'm doing more than my peer, it's good, even if it's not equitable. Is there any way to break that from your perspective, this kind of cookie problem of either childcare or emergency management?
So I think in part this is probably a question for a psychologist, not a philosopher, but we philosophers are very good at, speculating. So I'm happy to speculate. But again, I think it's in part, you actually have to hoist people on their own petard, right? So you have to sort of say, listen, so in the case of childcare, right? Like, do you take yourself to be in an equitable relationship with your heterosexual spouse? Yes or no? Do you agree that men and women are equal? Do you think that women are naturally better fit to raise children, right? And like lots of progressive dudes will say, no, like I'm a good feminist, I'm an ally, right? Whatever else, right? And so you can get them to consent to all of the things in principle, abstractly, right? And then once you've done that, then you go concrete, right? And then you say, okay, but given your expressed values, right, that you've just articulated, or that I've just helped you articulate here, right? Can you see how your behavior is at odds with that? Can you see how expecting a cookie for doing something that your spouse has been doing all along, and that instead of your reaction being like shame and horror, right? That like, oh my God, babe, I didn't realize how much of this work this was, like how much of your life revolved around this, how much slacking I'd been able to do, right? Instead of the response is, okay, well, yeah, sure, but I'm still doing more than that guy over there. Like, if that's going to be your defensive response, then like, okay, time for more couples therapy, I guess. Right? But because at the end of the day, right, again, to go back to that silly meme that I was talking about earlier, right? Like, I don't know how to convince you that you should care about other people. I don't know how to convince you that you should want to be a good person. Like, you have to meet me there, right? And if you don't come to the table with that, I'm not going to have a lot to actually work with, right? Other than like saying, well, okay, but like 5 minutes ago, you claimed to care about these things, right? So why did you stop caring about it when it actually affected what you're going to have to do and how many, Xbox you get to play in your downtime from your Zoom calls or whatever it was that you guys were doing during the pandemic, right? So in part, I think there's only so much as a philosopher I can give you, but it's not best to sort of dig too deep into my own personal history. But I think that's sort of the way we have to go. I don't know, Jordan, what do you do? Like when your students are, sort of like, espousing that certain sorts of, like progressive or liberal values that then actually don't show up in the reactions or in these sorts of things? Do you have tricks?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. One of my tricks actually was talking about disasters. I started thinking about disasters in part because I was teaching classes on ethics and social justice to a predominantly white student population that was just really skeptical that any of this mattered. And so I was like, let's look at Hurricane Katrina. Let's look at it. Let's look at an instance that is sort of incontrovertible. And I think, as Jeff was saying earlier, like the COVID data is another really good example of this, where part of what the disaster does is it just lays bare all of these structures that we can kind of ignore and dance around in normal times. But I think that at the same time, as you point to, it's also the case that lots of people who are committed to wanting to be good people, right, believing in social justice, then in a disaster feel threatened, right? And so then there's this like hoarding mentality. The statistics that always really strikes me is that the largest surge in new gun owners in the first few months of COVID was women and people of color, right? And so it points to the ways in which some of the people who we might expect to have more of a sort of whole community response to disasters sometimes have a really strongly self-defensive response to disasters for a lot of the reasons that you described. They have really good reason to think that way. But so it is a way in which, to me, disasters are this very interesting place where some of our normal structures of privilege and oppression, they get twisted. They get twisted in ways that allow us to tweak them for both good and sort of for ill. Right. And so I have found in teaching actually that bringing disaster context into the classroom was useful. And then COVID happened. And so it was just there. Right. So then we were just all doing it all the time. Right. But this actually gets me to one of my last questions, which comes back to Jeff's point earlier about sort of like, what is disaster science? Right. And I think you're right, Jeff, that we need it to be interdisciplinary. Right. Philosophers would like to be involved in the conversation. We think we have things to add, right? But
we have opinions.
Yes, exactly, right. But one of the things that really drove Mitch and I in this is thinking that there's sort of a set of, in particular, feminist philosophical tools that ought to be in the toolkit of those doing both inquiry around disasters as well as the practice of disasters. And so, a question that I want to ask all of you is what do you think, what are the tools that we need? Like, what are the tools that we could pull from a feminist toolkit that would be really concretely useful in disasters, either in disaster science or in disaster practice?
I can't speak to... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Everybody spoke. This is amazing.
I know, at the same time. That's feminism.
That's right. Absolutely. All right. Jeff, you go first.
Oh, well, I was jumping in to say I don't know that I'm qualified to answer specifically because I'm simply not aware of the toolkit to the extent that I should be to my own admission of shortcoming. I think the most detrimental thing to disaster science is to try to define it as a single science. Right? It's not something we can reduce down into molecules and atoms and atomic particles and things like that. It's something that, again, occurs at the intersection. And the introduction of different vantage points illuminates some sides of the problem and obscures others in the shadows. And we need more camera angles, not less. I think I jumped metaphors there, but you know what I'm saying. So I think that one of the things that I really love about what you're doing with your research and with your book is introducing, and maybe for me, opening my eyes to this idea of epistemology and sort of how we look at things, how we look at the world. Within the field, I think there are sort of, maybe I won't get into being too critical of folks not on this call, but talk about this too, like when we're working in the currency of peer-reviewed articles, we're not capturing things from the humanities. We're not capturing things from the arts, right? And so there are a lot of areas that we sort of define as science that we want to draw from to give us evidence. And then there are other things that sort of fundamentally get to how we look at the world around us and how we value the people around us and how we value the actions we take, which are very fundamental to the experience of a disaster and ultimately to the things that we can do about it to make it a more fair and just and holistic outcome. And by denying ourselves, by sort of trying to create definitions that are very rigid, that are very reductionist, that are very deterministic, we deny ourselves the ability to truly look at the intersections that matter the most. So I don't really say it apologetically that we don't know what disaster science is. I think it's great that we have hundreds of different vantage points on it. I think we need hundreds more. Because what we're really looking at is more of a disaster genome, something with many, many different variables that come into play differently and then is influenced by context, is influenced by all sorts of different things. I, again, sort of admit that I am woefully ignorant of, the tools that can be brought to the table through feminist philosophy and really through a lot of different branches. But I'm sold that, I think we all need to, those not in the field need to get smarter on what those are because, and I think you're really, really doing a great thing with your book in terms of sort of bridging some of these communities a little bit and providing new insights that are really doing something. And can I just say doing something novel in this field, not just retreading old ground that is sort of written and rewritten about that I'm very guilty of, but really, truly introducing something novel into the world of disaster management that I'm really thrilled to see for what it's worth.
Thanks.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So I think my response to this is actually going to be to answer a different question in a jerk move. And in an even bigger dick move. I know. And an even bigger dick move, I'm going to bring in your favorite threesome buddy, Kant.
Jesus. Come on, Carol.
Back. All right. So it's not quite Kant. It's actually a Kantian, one of the most famous Kantians, this guy named Rawls, John Rawls. He's a political philosopher, right? And basically, Rawls gives us, using a version of Kant, basically, Rawls gives us a way to think about a just society. Like, how do we figure out how to distribute resources in a just society? And he's got this really cool thought experiment. And when I'm teaching this to my undergrads, I teach it like this. I tell my students, let's pretend that all of us in this room, say just all of us on this call, say all four of us are going to start a new society, right? We're going to go to a desert island. We're going to create a completely new society. And we want to figure out how do we distribute the resources in a way that's fair. So we ask ourselves, okay, so what do you think is fair? And we can come up with some options. Like it could be, everyone just gets to take everything that they bring to the island, and then they whatever coconuts and fish we can find on the island, we split up equally. That's one rule of distribution, right? But that rule of distribution might disincentivize hard work, right? Because if we have to split up all the coconuts and fish equally, then like Jeff, if you're a really good fisher person, right? Then like why do you have to spend all day in the hot sun if you only get to keep a fraction of your catch anyway? These sorts of things, right? And so then maybe we could say, well, how about everyone just gets to keep everything they bring, and then plus just whatever they can collect on the island. Right. So that works really well for you, Jeff, because you're a great fisher person, right? And it works really well for you, Jordan, because it turns out you're really good at climbing trees, so you can get the coconuts, right? But like Mitch and I, we're actually pretty clumsy and we're not really good at either of those things. And so we're kind of screwed with this rule of distribution, right? Right. And again, you could do this for lots of different versions of it, right? There could be like a might makes right or a sort of strict egalitarian rule or lots of different options, right? But notice that whatever rules we agree to when we're claiming, no, this is just what's fair. Probably what we're doing is sneaking in some sense of this is how this rule is going to benefit me or people like me. Right, it's just kind of like human nature to do this, right? To sort of like sneak in these. So we say that we're being fair, but really we're sort of like benefiting ourselves in certain ways. And so Rawls has this thing. It says he has this sort of tweak the thought experiment, right? So he says, okay, so instead of getting to this desert island with a boat or whatever, right? We're actually going to get there with this weird like Star Trek transporter, where when Scotty beams you down onto the island, things about you that are kind of irrelevant from the point of view of justice might be different. Right, so here you might have brown hair, there you might be blonde. Here you might be nearsighted, there you might be farsighted. Here you might be tall, there you might be short, whatever it is. Fast, slow, right? Male, female, white, black, straight, queer, whatever it is, right? So suddenly, like you don't get to know these certain things about you. Rawls says that you should sort of think about this as if you're behind a veil of ignorance. So you're sort of ignorant about certain facts about you that are relevant from the moral point of view. Now ask yourself, what rules of distribution are you going to agree to from behind the veil of ignorance? Are they the same ones? Are you going to agree to a might makes right, everyone gets to keep their stuff rule if you don't actually know if you're really good at catching fish? Probably not, right? You're probably going to lean more in the direction of egalitarianism. And specifically, Rawls says, you're actually going to lean in the direction of what he calls a difference principle, right? So the difference principle is basically, it permits inequality in the distribution of resources insofar as that inequality benefits those who are the worst off. Right? Because it's in your best interest as someone who you don't know what you're going to be like on that island, right? It's in your best interest to choose rules of distribution that benefit the worst off first and best, because you might be that person. You don't know that you're that person or not, right? So it's just purely self-interested. It's in your best interest to help the people who need the help the most, right? So this is a very long-winded, and I apologize, and you can cut this in edits if you need to. It's a very long-winded way of sort of coming around to the explanation, right? That when we're thinking about distribution of resources or disaster management policy or whatever it is, like who should be what we care about? Should it be everyone in general? Should it be people like us? Or should it be people who actually need the help the most, right? And Rawls gives a pretty compelling Kantian answer for thinking that it's the latter. So that's not necessarily feminist, but it's, Rawls was feminist in certain ways, right? And so again, it's a way of sort of thinking about like what justice requires in a way that actually still can manage people's tendency to be self-interested.
And, that leads to my thought, which is kind of based on the Rawlsian kind of thought experiment. We leaned a lot on Miranda Fricker, on Christy Dotson, and the idea of epistemic injustice, that the reason that's the case, right? The reason we keep leaning on, Jeff and Jordan as the good Fisher people and like leaning into those stories or whatever is because some of these stories have more value than other stories. So we laid out in standpoint epistemology, one of the two sort of pillars we were on, which is the idea, as you mentioned, Carol, that we need to privilege these marginalized voices. We need to sort of listen to them and decenter them, or we need to center them from the margins. But the other side of that is understanding that the reason they are marginalized is not incidental. It is based on this idea of epistemic injustice, that we give some stories less value and less credibility than others. And that's pragmatically, that's so important to me because I've always found it impossible to bring forward emergency plans that elevate equity to the extent that you would reach something like a Rawlsian difference principle or something, an equity plan that would really help to make society more equitable, because the leader, the principal, whether that's a mayor or a governor or whoever, who receives that plan has this embedded epistemic injustice. Like they feel that they're being fair and they're working from a place of equity and equality. But some stories, just from a common sense perspective, their common sense tells them that some of these things are ridiculous to do. That's something that has often been said by governmental leaders in emergencies, is just that, there's some things that are realistic and there are some things that aren't realistic, and we need to separate them. It's like at the beginning of COVID-19, there's a Tony Fauci, and, God love Tony Fauci. I'm not, railing on Tony Fauci, but in one of his early press conferences, he sort of said, boy, this COVID thing is super bad. And boy, we're seeing these disparities for people of color, and those disparities will be there forever. And right now we've got to focus on COVID. And I really hope we're going to get to those disparities and fix them in the future, because they're really important. But right now, we got to kind of focus on COVID. I am not at all saying there are so many good disaster responders who are out there, so many people who are pushing for equity in disasters. My point is just that from a leadership perspective, there are some things that just don't seem like common sense to leaders, that in emergencies, they're going to say over and over again, that's not realistic. It's not a rational thing. We can't expect to be able to do this in a crisis. And in our view, you're always going to have resource limitations in a crisis. That's not what we're saying. But there's a way that our brains narrow to just focus on this one privileged perspective. And we have to understand the epistemic injustice that's kind of feeding that and find ways to counteract that.
Very quickly, because I know we've been on for a while. I said before I'd tell a story about something that made me angry. And so I don't want to leave you hanging, although I'm the only one I think that remembers. It's for my own edification.
No, I remember.
Yeah.
We're there. We're there for the anger.
I got a call this a couple of years ago from a legislative assistant it was an email reaching out and saying, hey, I work for so-and-so legislator in Congress. And, I want to talk to you about disaster stuff. And this was a representative who comes from a national security background. And so I guess all I'm trying to say with that is they work for somebody who should know better. And so I get on the call with them. And I had actually met with someone else on the national security staff who also we were talking through. And I said, off the record, what would you do? And so you'll hear this number thrown around sometimes. There are as many as 90 different disaster assistance programs across 20 different federal agencies. So imagine now you're someone struggling with transportation insecurity, hourly wages, no sick leave during COVID, all sorts of things. And now you have to navigate dozens of different programs in a disaster. Another colleague calls it a Jenga of federal disaster assistance, because they're not all activated at once. They're not all activated for the same reasons. They all have different rules. And so you end up with the survivors at the center of this, and those that have the resources to cope do well, and those that don't. And needless to say, we see in the data that whiter and wealthier communities have better access to disaster assistance than majority minority communities, than lower socioeconomic status, et cetera. And so we were talking through all of this, and I was sharing some of these ideas that another colleague had shared, which is that this is too complicated. That, some of the bolder ideas that I've heard have been repeal the Stafford Act, which is the fundamental disaster response legislation, replace it with something else, replace it with a simplified program. And so I was going through all of these different things, and then they said, yeah, we're not going to do any of that. And so I said, okay, you called me. What do you want to do? They said, we're looking for a quick win, something that we can get through this Congress. And so you want 91 programs across, it's like, how is this helpful to it? And it was just, and so this was another reason sort of behind like my focus on the incentive structures, is that the incentive structure just did not create a pathway for expending any political capital on meaningful change. Anyway, thank you for indulging me. I don't have a lot of people I can talk about this with, and so I appreciate you being here for me in this moment.
No, Jeff, you actually already answered my last question. So, A+ student, you anticipated and you got there. So my last question was going to be, I was hoping, we started in a really dark place, right? So I was hoping, Carol, you write about the importance of sort of a cautious optimism in thinking about COVID. So my question for all of you was, what's the most hopeful or useful idea you've come across for resetting or reframing disaster policy and narrative? Jeff, I love that you told us what your most useful idea was, and then you told us exactly why it's never going to happen. Super here for it. That's also how I approach useful and helpful ideas. But let's be useful and hopeful for like a minute. So sort of lightning round, what do you think? What could work?
Oh, it's hard.
Yeah, I would say, we have more people coming to the table than ever before, from the public sector, from the private sector, from across academia. I have some friends coming out with this amazing book on disasters and feminist philosophy. And in all seriousness, we have more knowledge at our fingertips than ever before. This field is extraordinarily young compared to other fields, and has just a lot of really exciting thought coming into it, and a lot of very creative ideas that are really seeking to kind of wrap their hands around all of this. I'm genuinely, despite everything I've said up to this moment, genuinely hopeful because of that. And it's honestly, it's really exciting to see in the students that I'm working with and teaching, the colleagues that I'm working with professionally, is that, look, I don't think anyone thinks that we've cracked the code on this. But that hasn't stopped anyone from trying and from really figuring out how to work together and how to embrace other ideas and do this. So to me, that's the most inspiring thing. It's we haven't figured it out, but I don't think any of us are giving up.
Yeah, I would say, I think, and again, this is someone who, I'm not a disaster preparedness person. I'm merely a humble philosopher, but I am someone who spends a lot of time with Gen Z and in the classroom. And I do think that, there is something about this generation, right? They're definitely messed up because of the pandemic and all the various ways, but they're also a group of people that I think it comes naturally to think about things at a macroscopic level for them in a way that I've never seen, right? So they're politicized in a certain way, right? Things that used to just be academic jargon, things like intersectionality or colonialism, or this is their bread and butter, right? We see this, with the Gaza protests, right? These are very highly politically educated people, given their age, right? And so I think, and from what I'm hearing from you disaster folks, right, these are big picture problems that need big picture solutions, right? And I do think that coming up, right, the younger generations more equipped to understand that and to respond to it and to sort of see that as reasons to do things in a new way than any other. So if there's any sort of cause for optimism, I think that the kids are all right, or at least enough of them might be, right? That we can they might be sort of open to hearing the conversation in this way, that maybe in ways that their parents or grandparents weren't.
I think we're screwed.
I think we're also screwed, yes.
I think
I like that Carol's like, I will not be out pessimistic here. Come on.
I mean, it's funny because I'm I'm often optimistic in these, I work in emergencies, but always trying to move forward. And, it's just, and we'll talk about this over the next couple of episodes. I do think that the way we think about disasters is encased in a way we imagine disasters to be a certain way that's wrong. Like we imagine disasters as these kind of Wild West phenomena, and that imagination constrains what our policy options are, right? Because we imagine disasters in a wrong way that constrains our policy choices. And that imagination in turn is caught within this larger epistemological system of how we think about things that wants to stay the way it is, that like doesn't want to change. And for those reasons, I am not optimistic that we will achieve a policy solution outside of a disaster. And the reason that this is like I'm just going to go super all the way downer, maybe to end this one. There's this guy, Walter Scheidel, who wrote a great book, Tracking Inequality Through Human History, and looking at what it actually takes to make human society more equal over the last 5,000 years, looking at all this archaeological and historic data. And he said there are only two things. Okay, thing one is that the world gets bad enough, like a third of the people die in the Black Death, right? Or millions of people die in a World War II scenario. So many people die that the world gets more equal because they just see all of that horror and it moves them towards equality partly practically. Like just to make society function, they have to make it more practical. Or you have to have a policy response in the disaster that is more equal than it needs to be. And the only example he can give in all of human history is the New Deal during the Great Depression, that it was used, and Michel Dauber says this, disaster response principles to make society more equal, even though the Great Depression was bad, but it wasn't like Black Death bad, right? It didn't mean a third of the population had to die first. Society said, okay, we're going to use this crisis to make us more equal. So the only optimism I can say, and it's probably going to take us 8-9 chapters to get there, is we have to find a way to rewire ourselves at the moment of crisis so that we use new natality, we use this perceptual shift we have to break these chains of nostalgic recovery during a crisis.
Awesome. All right. Well, those some quality darkness there at the end, you guys. Well done. Well done. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. This was super fun, and we're grateful that you guys would come on and talk to us about this stuff. So
absolutely, thanks for having me.
Anytime.
I really thanks a lot, Carol, for bringing Kant back. I've just been trying to get that bastard out of my life for so many years. Bringing him back.
I swear, if I see the promo materials for this and it does not reference or say threesome with Kant, I'm going to be sorely disappointed.
I agree.
I prefer actually what BDSM can offer risk analysis. I really think that's
yeah. I would buy that t-shirt.
And I don't know why you need me with your aim to deceive me, and you just keep bleeding me dry.
So we'll check it in.
All right, that was so fun. It was a great conversation. I'm so glad we got to talk about how we handle disasters and the problems that it causes. And now we need to talk about why.
Yeah, I've really got to rethink I don't know. Now I don't know how sexy we should get in this. I'm a little uncomfortable. I think that's the thing. That was a level of overlapping of sex and emergencies that's uncomfortable for me as an emergency manager, but it makes me rethink a lot about how we handle it. That gives the disaster cycle a whole new meaning.
That is a level of talking about sex and BDSM that I am completely comfortable with as a feminist philosopher. So probably there's going to be more of that.
Okay. All right. Great. I'm going to gird my loins.
Well, on the next episode, we are going to talk about how we imagine disasters, including one of our favorite topics, disaster movies. And we'll talk about how the ways in which we imagine disasters shapes policy as well as our practice of disasters. And, maybe some BDSM. Who knows?
See you next time. Loins.
Tell me you want me to love you. Tell me you want me to love you. Tell me you want me to love you more.
Tough Shift is produced by me, Mitch Stripling, with original music from Victor. If you like what we're doing, buy the book. You can sign up at disastersandsocialchange.org for a discount code. Stay connected. Stay curious.
Tell me you want me to love you. Tell me you want me to love you.